Here in Section 12 of Module 3, we're going to move away from license applications and talk about agreements under the ITAR, something entirely different. An agreement, as you'll note in just a moment, is more of a long-term approval for certain and specific activities. Let's see exactly what they are. So in bullet point 1, we can preface by saying that in addition to license approvals, DDTC can also approve agreements, those longer-term arrangements, mostly with third parties. Let's elaborate on that point, starting with our second bullet. Under the ITAR, agreements are generally characterized as three different scenarios. A manufacturing license agreement, where a third party is approved to manufacture, a technical assistance agreement, and a distribution agreement. Let's jump into each one of them specifically. A manufacturing license agreement, as we said, can be characterized perhaps as a contract manufacturing agreement. Here's why. It is an agreement whereby a U.S. person grants a foreign person an authorization to manufacture defense articles abroad that involves, for a sub-bullet point, the export of technical data, defense articles or performance of a defense service, or use by the foreign person of technical data or defense articles previously exported by the U.S. person. So let's look at this again. It's an agreement, a long-term agreement, manufacturing related, whereby that U.S. person grants a foreign person an authorization to manufacture defense articles abroad, outside of the United States. Could involve the export of technical data, actual defense articles, or performance of a defense service, or even, second sub-bullet point, use by that foreign person of tech data, defense articles that were previously exported by the U.S. person. So we're talking about a manufacturing environment here, a manufacturing license agreement. A technical assistance agreement is different. It's an agreement for the performance of a defense service or the disclosure of technical data, as opposed to an agreement granting a license to manufacture defense articles. So we're covering things like defense services or the disclosure of technical data. Very consistent with everything that we've talked about. Defense articles, defense services, technical data. So a technical assistance agreement covers those intangibles, service and technical data. A distribution agreement, entirely different because, as the name would indicate, more related to logistics, to actual distribution. So what is it? Well, it's an agreement between U.S. persons and foreign persons for the warehousing and distribution of defense articles outside the United States. So a third party, a foreign person, is going to provide warehousing, distribution, and logistics services of defense articles outside the U.S. These distribution agreements must first be approved by DDTC in writing. And important to note, last bullet point, such agreements are limited to unclassified defense articles. There's that distinction between classified and unclassified once again. And must contain conditions for special distribution and use and reporting. So DDTC is saying, yes, registrants can enter into distribution agreements, but the level of custodial care over that relationship and the articles that are involved in the distribution agreement have to be very, very tight. So much of what we've talked about throughout our ITAR conversation has had to do with ITAR licensing requirements, but it's equally salient to bring up these types of agreements that can support ongoing relationships. We're going to take up an entirely new subject now, violations under the ITAR. We've said from the very beginning just how critically important compliance with the ITAR really is. So what happens if persons violate the details of the ITAR? So we're going to run through a list, and it's found in 127(1)(a) of the ITAR that says engaging in the following activities is unlawful without first obtaining the required license or other written approval from DDTC. First, to export or attempt to export from the U.S. any defense article or technical data. That's a big no-no, obviously, without first obtaining the required license or other written approval. You have a license or other written approval, you can do these things. You don't have a license or a written approval, and you cannot. It's pretty cut and dry in that regard. Dealing with those intangibles, second sub-bullet point, it's also a violation to furnish or attempt to furnish any defense service without the proper license or written approval. So tangibles and intangibles. Looking at our next sub-bullet point, also a violation to re-export or retransfer or attempt to re-export or retransfer any defense article, technical data, or defense services from one foreign end user end use or destination to another foreign end user, end use or destination. And it's all about this being a violation without first obtaining the required license or other written approval. So if we're looking here, it's about re-exporting or re-transferring. Articles that have been exported already, we're talking about re-exporting or re-transferring without the proper approval. And that's a defense article, technical data, or defense service from one foreign end user or destination to another. So an article is exported, it's in the hands of a foreign end user, re-exports or retransfers without a license, total violation. What else do we have here? Well, for a sub-bullet point, to import or attempt to import any defense article whenever a license is required. So we've said this a bunch of times. ITAR deals with exports, permanent as well as temporary, but also imports and temporary imports. Second sub-bullet point is significant because what it's saying is that persons don't have to actually engage in these violations. They can conspire to engage, to conspire to export, import, re-export, retransfer, furnish or cause to be exported, imported, re-exported, retransferred, or furnished any defense article, technical data, or defense service. So it's about conspiring, not just doing, but conspiring to do so. Let's move on. Sub-bullet point, to possess or attempt to possess any defense article with intent to export in violation of any regulation, license, approval, or order issued thereunder. Cannot do that without first obtaining the required license or other written approval. To either possess or attempt to possess, try to get a defense article with intent to export that is definitely in violation of a regulation, an existing license or approval, or any order issued thereunder. Some other points, as we'll note in our first bullet, per 127(1)(b) of the ITAR, it is also unlawful to violate any of the terms or conditions of a license or approval or any exemption that is allowed. So if one receives a license approval, it's not a carte blanche. One has to follow the specific terms of that license. So you can't violate the terms of a license approval. Second sub-bullet point, it is also unlawful to engage in the business of brokering activities for which registration and a license or written approval is required. You'll recall our definition of brokering, that middle person that brings together party A with party B. One cannot engage in that business of brokering activities for which a registration and a license or written approval is required. Second to the last slide on violations under the ITAR, per 127(1)(b), it is also unlawful to engage in the U.S. in manufacturing or exporting defense articles or furnishing defense services without complying with registration requirements. This ties back our earlier point of persons, companies, having to be registered with the DDTC before they can even think about applying for a license. So one cannot manufacture or export defense articles or services without that registration being in place. This is a reiteration of the point we made earlier. 127(1)(c) also states, this is our last slide on violations, any person who is granted a license, other approval, or an exemption is responsible for the acts of employees, agents, brokers, and all authorized persons to whom possession of the defense article, including technical data, that has been entrusted. So the registrant receiving a license authorization is also responsible for the acts of their own employees, but also third parties, agents, brokers, etc. So the responsibility for that transaction, for the export control, for compliance, is outside of the registrant's organization as well. So a freight forwarder, an agent, a broker, that registrant, that party that receives the license, is also responsible for the acts of these persons as well. Trade tip, it's a long one, but an important one. The DDTC strongly encourages the voluntary disclosure of information that may have violated any control provision of the AECA, the Arms Export Control Act, or any regulation, order, license, or other authorization. What does this mean? Well, the operative phrase here is voluntary disclosure. Should a person, should a company realize that perhaps they made a mistake, or even if it wasn't a mistake, voluntary disclosure is looked upon favorably by the DDTC. You're basically unilaterally going to the DDTC and confessing that a mistake, or maybe something that wasn't a mistake, took place. The government, not only DDTC, but other agencies as well, is really quite explicit about how favorably they look upon voluntary disclosure. Does not mean that a person is going to get off the hook for a violation, but at least a voluntary disclosure is looked upon more favorably. Let's wrap up this section with 2 slides on record-keeping requirements under the ITAR. And as our image to the right shows, hopefully it's not that cumbersome a process. At least it can be done electronically. Per 122.5a of the ITAR, any person that is required to register with the DDTC must maintain records concerning the manufacture, acquisition, and disposition of the following. Well, of course, everything that we've talked about, record-keeping applies. Defense articles, technical data, defense services, and brokering activities too. One thing that we haven't mentioned, last sub-bullet point that's quite critical to point out, is the record-keeping requirements around any information on political contributions, fees, or commissions paid or received per Part 130 of the ITAR. So if companies, persons are making political contributions or paying fees or commissions related to ITAR-controlled activities, it has to be disclosed, and it also has to be maintained for a period of time. We'll see how long that period is in just one moment. But this idea of political contributions, fees, and commissions, it's in Part 130 of the ITAR, and well worth mentioning here. So these records must be kept of all license applications, the licenses themselves, exemptions, and any of those related documents that we talked about. All those records must be maintained for a period of 5 years from the expiration of a license or other approval, or if under an exemption, from the date of the transaction. I mentioned briefly a moment ago that records can be kept in electronic format, and those records must be made available at all times to DDTC or a person designated by DDTC. So in the unlikely event that a company receives a visit from a DDTC employee or a designated person by the DDTC, those records have to be made available immediately. So this is where we wrap up Section 12, and we'll be picking up our last section, starting with foreign military sales. We'll see you in a couple of minutes.